Protein is the key to muscle growth. Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. Again, we do all have this talk about fats. We have this talk about carbohydrate, but the thing that we have to remember ultimately is that these things are really fuel sources for us. That is what they are. They obviously have other things that they do regarding different hormone responses. But when you look closer and closer at all the available data, it really is protein. It is protein that drives the entire muscle building process, and protein that can even potentially handle all of our glycogen replenishment, all those things. So we do need to understand that in this context. And I'm not saying that the studies are wrong when they're like, well, at a certain amount of protein, there's no additional muscle growth. Well, that's also assuming, number one, that you are consuming adequate carbohydrate and fat for fuel sources. But those things can easily be replaced even with protein, and we have to remember that, and especially when it comes to post-workout recovery, right? Especially when it comes to post-workout recovery. But I'm going to get over to the fact in a minute that when those aren't adequate, protein still can 100% drive the muscle building process when it's taken high enough, and that's what the data is showing us. But when you start looking at different studies on say post-workout protein feeding, amino acids, things like that, we start looking at this data over and over and over. We see that protein intake scales with muscle protein synthesis uptime. Okay, it scales with the amount of training you do and all these things. A lot of times in certain situations are like, well, we saw no additional muscle protein synthesis by going over 30 or 40 grams in one feeding immediately after, at least in terms of the spike, right? At least in terms of the spike, but that was when we did smaller workouts. The more muscles that were involved and the more work that was done, it scaled. So a lot of times when they're taking people who aren't that big yet, they don't have as much muscle, obviously, and they do just an upper body versus say a full body workout, the amount of protein that created a larger spike went up. In other words, the more training you did, the more protein you do seem to benefit from. And that would make a lot of sense. And we've seen that in numerous studies. But then we've also seen studies to where very large amounts of protein were fed at once. Like, again, we're talking 100 grams in one sitting. The muscle protein uptime just lasted longer. So in other words, more protein still produced a more robust response. It just didn't spike it to higher levels. It just sustained those levels for hours and hours longer than say, 20, 30, 40 grams. So we're still back over to that point of very large protein intakes is producing an effect there. Also the same thing to look at when we look at protein intake given and then carbohydrate added. Okay, because we all point out, yes, insulin is anabolic. We need an insulin response. We need some glucose. We need those things. But muscle glycogen doesn't get that depleted during lifting. And I'm sorry, there's just no way around it. And the only reason we're even burning that much glucose is, say, if we're eating large amounts of carbohydrate and that's what we're burning at the moment. Yeah, that's what we're burning between all of our work sets, during our resting, during the heavy breathing. The lifting itself, the actual lifting itself doesn't burn that much glycogen. We're talking, a few grams of carbohydrate, right? And it takes a really intense workout to burn like 30 grams. I mean, we're talking really high volume workouts can burn maybe 30 grams of carbohydrate. See where we're about to go with this? That is not hard to replenish. You're almost going to get that from trace amounts from other foods, right? You could be on a low carb diet and still hit that relatively quickly. Okay? And that's assuming nothing else can turn to glucose, but protein will. Protein will still do it. So that is kind of the take home there that we've noted in the data, that when extra carbohydrate are added to the protein post-workout, there's no additional muscle protein synthesis. Okay? There's none. And it may produce a slightly faster muscle glycogen restoration, but that's going to happen in a few hours anyways, right? So it's just quicker. But it doesn't seem to be correlated with additional muscle growth. right? It's not correlated with it. It doesn't seem to be measurable because, again, we have to understand the muscle protein synthesis is what we're talking about for muscle growth, okay? Everything else is just storage factors that can come and go. The actual tissue growth, it's all protein, okay? It's all protein. So that protein turnover is what we're looking at, okay? And we also need to keep in mind your body turns over something like 200 to 300 grams of its own protein every single day. So your body is always recycling protein, even from your muscle tissue, different organs. It's doing it all day long. So you have a big pool of it that is flowing through the body. Okay? So this is a continual process. And again, protein is the driver of it. And my point here is we aren't finding sufficient data showing that carbohydrate or fat themselves really contribute significantly to muscle growth other than the insulin response or improvements in insulin sensitivity. So that's really what we're talking about. Well, improvements in insulin sensitivity can happen from essential fatty acids and stuff too, not just carbohydrates. So that's the thing to think about, like omega-3 fats. If your diet has sufficient or really good amounts of quality omega-3 fats, that's going to improve insulin sensitivity. If fibers kept high, are going to improve insulin sensitivity. Lots of training will improve insulin sensitivity. And if insulin sensitivity is high, we don't need as much. We're going to get a more robust muscle growth response in general. And that's what we found, is that to maximize that benefit, even post-training, protein alone seems to be sufficient to do that. And we have to look at it that way. And all the bros told us this for years before lots of other studies with this stuff. It was always protein, protein, protein. That's what muscles are built up. And it worked. It absolutely worked. But what we're finding more and more with more data, higher protein equals lower body fat. So again, because sufficient protein, once it's reached, will always give us the anabolic response we need. But we don't necessarily need as much carbohydrate or fat for the muscle building process. So if you're chasing purely lean gains, just hammering protein works. And you don't even need a calorie surplus in that case. Like a lot of protein overfeeding, it ends up creating a slight deficit. So then people lose body fat. And they lose body fat faster with all the high protein. But the muscle growth still occurs. So even if the protein overfeeding forces you to eat less and you're in a deficit, you still gain the muscle tissue. You just get improved body composition with it, right? So I want to be clear, high protein intakes really are the key to muscle growth and lean gains. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.